Sure. Why don't you go ahead?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Hello for everybody. First of all, I wish I could attend the forum and the conference in New York, but as you know, or maybe you don't know, I lost the forum in person because of the restrictions in movements on the checkpoint of Gaza checkpoint and also from Azaiza crossing. And I'm here to try to give you information about what I usually see and find the field while I'm doing the research and the work. Today, I wanted to focus about the electricity crisis in Gaza and how this affects the people and in their daily life. Today, while I'm coming to the meeting, I live in Deir Balah city, and I'm coming to Gaza city. And today is a Friday, and it's the first Friday after Ramadan in Gaza. And maybe, as you know, you don't know that the summer vacation is started in Gaza city. And I find thousands of people, children, youth, women, in the beach in my way. They leave their homes because most of them they didn't find electricity, and because now it's very hot here also. But these people don't know, or maybe most of them don't know that every day 100 million liters of sewage system is pumped to the sea, to Gaza Sea, without any sanitation for it. And that's making the swimming in Gaza is prohibited. And I can't imagine. I can't imagine to see what will be in the coming month for if the children, wanted to swim because they didn't find a way. They wanted to swim. There's no any other choice for them. And how this will affect them in the way that every day, every year in Gaza we discover a new disease is coming to the region and also to Gaza. And we are sure that most of this disease is coming from the water and from the swimming. This is one of the examples that I wanted to imagine about the life in Gaza, the daily life in Gaza. It's like a basic rights for children who don't have any other alternatives. They want just to go to swim in the sea and they can't. And also, I want to speak about the life in the hospitals. Before 1 month, I visit a children's hospital in Gaza. It's Abdulaziz Rantisi Hospitals, which focus on the children or working just with the children. And in that hospital, all the departments is belonging of or need electricity to work. The wash, the ICU, also the oxygen, and also the sewage of the hospital itself. And I started to imagine that big generators, is working more than 16, 17 hours per day, because we speak just about 4 hours of electricity per day in Gaza, every 12 hours. And in the same time, that children who are in needed for that you can't working in the hospitals without this electricity. But if the generators is shutting off because it's a generator, it's not designed to work 24 hours. What will happen in the hospitals? What will happen for the children who are inside the ICU and they need the oxygen? In the same time, and looking for that, in the same time that Israel is still prohibited to entering generators to Gaza and also to enter spare parts of generators to Gaza. And you can't imagine, and I can't imagine how the hospitals will be work without that electricity. The life of the children, the life of the people there. Another example also from the land, from the field. farmers in Gaza. Now all the agriculture or the plants need water, and 4 hours and 8 hours of electricity for water for the agriculture sector is not enough. The farmers in Gaza is forced to leave their homes and to leave their children in order to sleep in the field because they want to wait for the electricity at the night in order to have water for their plants. And they also, it's like fields of agriculture who are far away from their homes, and they have to sleep in the field without any concerns of their safety in that field. And I met a lot of them who are leave their home for more than 48 hours, and they are living in the same area of living, but he forced to be there because he wanted to wait for the electricity. And also, there's a lot of examples that we can focus on. Or, the time will not save us to tell how much examples of the suffering, the daily suffering for people in Gaza you can find day by day. But what I wanted to say that the life of the 2 million civilians in Gaza are not a game. For how long they will use the Gaza case and the life of the people in Gaza as a game. We all here in Gaza and also in New York in the forum understand that the electricity problem, part of it is a political problem. And there is main part in these problems. Israel as the occupied part and also Hamas and the BA are the responsible. And we wanted to tell them that we cannot wait until you kill us. All of you will kill me and kill my children, and you don't try to return back to thinking about the life of the people. That's all for now. I hope this forum can come at the end with the results and some points that we can raise about the problem of Gaza and the time that we have to stop and end the sacrificing of Gaza people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I found your statement extremely interesting, because I think for a lot of people who just follow the general media and see something like, oh, there was a threat to the electricity in Gaza in the last couple of days. Diesel has come in from Egypt, which has as if that somehow has averted a crisis. Of course, we didn't hear you talk about that at all, because that really hasn't averted a crisis at all. Maybe that's averted from 4 hours to 3 hours, but it's hard to talk about 4 hours as anything but an extreme crisis, and that's what we heard from you. I think Nora wanted to follow from there.
Sure. Thank you for having me be part of this forum. I want to make a comment about what was said previously by my two colleagues, as well as provide a little bit of guidance, maybe of different ways that we can think about it. So first, just to pick up on the description of the humanitarian crisis. In many ways, we discuss humanitarian crises as a condition of what people suffer through and live by. Oftentimes, it's appropriate to do that especially after natural disasters. The difference between the Gaza Strip and conditions of national disaster, like earthquakes in Haiti or floods and hurricanes in New Orleans in the United States, is that the situation in Gaza is not a natural disaster, it's a human-made disaster, and it's one that we are all participating in. The blockade, land siege, a naval blockade of 10 years has caused a condition today that we can also reverse. We have read over and over statements that by 2020, the World Health Organization says that the Gaza Strip will be unlivable. One has to question, have we become so numb to those numbers that it almost becomes performative for us to list these humanitarian conditions as if we can't do anything about it, when at the heart of it, it's the human-made political decisions that have created them. So unlike other situations where our hands are tied, in this situation we exercise the most agency. The blockade and the naval blockade, and the land siege has been in existence for now a decade. But before that, there was full closure in the Gaza Strip since 1993, when Israel first built the perimeter around the Gaza Strip. That was before Hamas even launched its first suicide bombing, even though we're told repeatedly that the purpose of the blockade is a security purpose and that there must be a disarmament of the armed groups within the Gaza Strip in order to lift it. The logic of that, one, doesn't make sense. Secondly, even saying that is putting the entire civilian population at risk by securitizing them and somehow making it acceptable in our framework to think that 2 million Palestinians who have nothing to do with this can be responsible for these political demands. It also obfuscates the fact that this kind of securitization has begun well before even 1993, when in 1971, the Gaza Strip was divided into different territorial units and stated as a military issue within the Israeli regime. At that point, there wasn't even a Hamas. The Fida'iyyin that were posing the security risk were associated with different Palestinian groups and under the umbrella of the Palestinian Liberation Organization. I'm not providing a history lesson. The purpose here is that none of the situation that we're faced with is new, is novel, is that challenging, that we haven't been living through this, that we can't think of how to get past it. And so we have many different ways in the language of law, and we are at the United Nations, which upholds the rule of law, to think about this: humanitarian, human rights, political, and military. The blockade it triggers every single one of these analyses as a humanitarian issue, and Article 33 that prohibits this kind of collective punishment, as a human rights issue, and what are we limiting when students can't pursue their education, when young people can't identify themselves and fulfill their social identities, which we are also
Maybe if we could
concerned.
come back to advocacy strategies toward the end.
Oh, this was an advocacy. So I just wanted to say that if we were to think about this in these 4 different analytical frameworks of humanitarian, human rights, political, and military, what becomes quite evident and obvious is that this boils down to either the humanitarian crisis, where we frame the Palestinians stuck in Gaza as hapless victims of this condition, or as a military situation, where we discuss the blockade as, and blockade is actually an act of war, which then pushes up against the fact that does Israel have the right to wage war against a territory that it occupies, for which it is the sole, not necessarily the sole responsibility, because Hamas obviously is the ruling party, has responsibility, but this triggers whether or not you can usurp that responsibility, declare that the Gaza Strip is neither independent, the occupation hasn't ended, nor is it still occupied. Instead, Israel has created a new category in law of sui generis, unlike anything like it, to call it a hostile territory. We are creating new categories in law in order to match the political aspirations here, rather than challenge them altogether. I think the tools are very much at our disposal. The analysis is at our disposal, and it becomes a question of, are we going to define a threshold? Is there a threshold of crisis that will finally trigger us to lift the blockade without any preconditions? At which point do we consider this? We've called it a crisis, we've called it a catastrophe, we've listed the number 3 babies have died in the past few days. At which point does that threshold become triggered? If we can't agree on lifting the blockade now, can we agree on when it will be lifted and what crisis we will not tolerate? Thank you.
Tania, would you like to weigh in on this before we move on?
Sure. So I certainly agree with a lot of the points that have been made. I'd like to take a step back maybe and speak a little bit from my own experience. I've been with Gisha now for 10 years, exactly the period of time of the closure. And we mark these anniversaries, but of course there's a wider context and the dates are a little bit of a fudging of things. But certainly Gaza, as has been mentioned, has been closed off gradually. It culminated in the 2007 takeover of Gaza by Hamas. But even that closure has undergone some important changes, and I'll get back to that in a minute. I do want to talk about the way that Israel characterizes the policy, or if there's a policy at all. We've heard about different kind of goals and whether it's about security or not. So since 2007, Israel has actually characterized its policy often as what it calls the separation policy. The word in Hebrew is bidul, and that can actually mean separation in the sense of isolation, but also differentiation or distinction. And on the ground, we see the policy expressed in both senses of this word in Hebrew. Both the physical separation of Gaza, particularly from the West Bank, and Israel has said that its goal is to prevent the transfer of terrorist infrastructure, which, as we know in today's day and age, you don't just need to kind of hand somebody a letter to get that kind of thing done. And making a distinction also between residents of Gaza and the West Bank. The idea was to cause a divergence in the economies and in the general well-being of the population for the purpose of applying pressure. So sometimes that's the explanation we get, separation. But often we don't get that. And we actually know that the Security Cabinet in Israel has rarely discussed the policy on Gaza, and that once when the Deputy Defense Minister, former Deputy Defense Minister, was asked why is this policy continuing, he said inertia. We also know that after the last major military operation, there were some symbolically important changes in policy, even if they were slight. I think that they did make clear that there actually is no coherent policy. What we see is really a set of different tactics that are in response often to international pressure, regional interests, inertia, and also certainly demographic goals. Some in the Israeli government see the isolation of Gaza as a means of maintaining perpetual control of the West Bank. The new U.S. ambassador to Israel once said it like this. He said, removing 2 million Palestinians from the equation. So I want to encourage us also in this session and for the rest of the day to realize that we're not just talking about a humanitarian situation. We're talking about something that is deeply connected to what's happening in the West Bank and policy goals there. And that's certainly a key driver of policy. How is it expressed on the ground in what we're dealing with on a daily basis, movement and access, permits for individuals? So it's nearly impossible to relocate from Gaza to the West Bank. Students can't travel, families can't reunite, a person can't travel for professional development or for a better job. But a one-way ticket from the West Bank to Gaza is available at any time you'd like. The most concrete goal that we're hearing being articulated by Israeli officials right now is that they're managing the situation, both in Gaza and in the West Bank, i.e. they're trying to keep things mostly as they are. Of course, as we know, that this kind of management of the situation reinforces the separation and is certainly contributing to those who have annexationist or demographic goals in the West Bank. But I also want to highlight that I think that this is particularly a kind of policy of hubris and cruelty. I think that what's happening in the Gaza Strip and what's been happening now for at least the last 10 years is one of the biggest experimentation projects on the planet. The idea is, how do you test the breaking point of 2 million people? How do you push hard enough, but not so hard that the situation explodes? And I want to say also that I'm sorry to see that some Palestinian leaders have joined in on this cruel experiment lately. And I hope that we can also talk about that. So I'll stop there for now.
Well, thanks very much. You know, you in your remarks, you talked about how the situation in the West Bank cannot be separated from the situation in Gaza, or the policy toward the West Bank cannot be separated toward the policy in Gaza. But when we look at the title of this session, right, it's Gaza, the indispensability, you know, to the state of Palestine. You know, I think some people might look at that title and wonder if at this point, after 10 years of separation and even longer of closure, that whether there should be a question mark after that title. Is indeed Gaza an indispensable part of the state of Palestine? Nora, do you want to take that one to start?
Sorry to interrupt. We have Majida here. She arrived 10-15 minutes ago, just to let you know.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll make sure to come to Majida very soon. Nora, do you want to start?
Oh, I mean, the short answer, and I'm sure all of us will definitely agree, is that absolutely it must be an integral part. I think what Tania is pointing out is that this combined policy of a lack of coherency, inertia, and containment is actually an attempt to separate the question of the Gaza Strip from the rest of the question of Palestine in a way that securitizes the population, sets it off as a military national security challenge that obfuscates the politics underpinning the ongoing conditions and the ways that we can actually resolve them. So for us just to think about how much this is part of the bigger picture and its relationship to the West Bank is consider the fact that Hamas recently amended its charter. For all those who try to frame it as an irrational actor, an armed group driven by some sort of irrational hatred or quest, are actually denying the empirical evidence that it recognized the 1967 border, that it actually distanced itself from the Muslim Brotherhood, that it is trying to assert itself as a political player, and it's falling on deaf ears, putting into question, are they the problem or are we the problem for not engaging in a political solution? Then we have to consider, let's look at the West Bank. What is being asked in the Gaza Strip as a condition for lifting the siege? Disarmament and removal of a Palestinian political party. Similar conditions that were imposed on the PLO for nearly 2 decades until the PLO amended its charter, recognized Resolution 242, entered into the negotiations, and as a result of that, 242 has been redefined in the course of those negotiations. The Palestinian Authority in the West Bank has not resisted the U.S.-Israeli framework for peacemaking and has in fact participated in security coordination and economic normalization. And what has it shown us in the West Bank? What has that policy of acquiescence and participation and recognition of amending the charter and the renunciation of armed violence, what has that shown the Palestinians in the West Bank, and how have they been repaid? With a heaven of human rights, with freedom of movement, with independence and sovereignty? There is, obviously it's a rhetorical series of rhetorical questions. The conditions on the ground demonstrate that the situation has only gotten worse at a less price tag to Israel diplomatically, economically, and militarily. These are the prospects that we're offering to Palestinians. And so as we think about this question, absolutely Gaza is an indispensable part of the Palestinian state, but we must also continue to think about this entire question. We are fragmenting it into this internecine conflict between 2 Palestinian political parties at the expense of thinking, and then as the region, the conflict within the region, at the expense of thinking that what's being lost in the folds of this is that there is no clear political horizon for Palestinian independence, that the strategies that have been laid out have been inadequate, and what's been being offered as the condition for lifting the siege isn't promising. If anything that we've seen in the West Bank is an indication of the best that we have to gain from a peace process, as going on as such, defined by the US bilaterally under the framework of Oslo.
Thanks. I'd like to bring Majda into the conversation, if I could, by asking her to reflect on the same question about the relationship of Gaza in the West Bank right now. As we talk about this, I'm reminded of a funny but sad anecdote. When I was living in Jerusalem, I work for Crisis Group. I was in the Crisis Group office in Jerusalem, and I was there with a colleague who was on the phone with Gaza, and she said to her friend or colleague in Gaza, she asked her, "Emta tiji al Palestine?" When are you coming to Palestine? So said from the West Bank, said to Gaza, when are you coming to Palestine? And this was a number of years ago already. You know, she caught herself immediately. They both laughed about it, ha ha ha. But of course, not so funny, right? So let's ask Majda to reflect a little bit on the relationship between Gaza and the West Bank now, please.
Thank you so much, and I'm sorry for being late. I had a situation. To be honest, it's very difficult for me to deal with this question because, first of all, I think putting this whole thing about Gaza, West Bank, and Jerusalem each time in a workshop or an event in different groups, it put us all, even if we have the good intention, put us all in this place where we actually ourselves are dividing the whole question of Palestine. Of course, Gaza has a unique situation, and it's very, very, very difficult. It's very different from the situation of West Bank, but the situation of West Bank is not better. The situation in Jerusalem maybe is even worse. I have friends and family and colleagues who are in West Bank and Jerusalem, and what I hear from them is, reflects the same psychology behind, this whole torture that is happening to the Palestinian in general. Now, for us in Palestine, I think, one of the very, very important things that we need to remind ourselves of is that, we don't need to speak about Palestine as a humanitarian case. Of course, there were lots of attacks and wars and, invasions and the blockades and, all these kinds of things. But we need to remember that Palestine is a very young country. The population is very young, and the natural resources are very rich, just that we don't have access to it. The whole issue of the blockade of Gaza, everybody knows about the details. The reports from the UN and from ICRC and the human rights organizations, and even stories and testimonies of people are reflecting what's happening. I don't think we need to talk about it and describe it anymore to people. I think people don't want to know anymore about it. And this is why I think our focus should be on accountability to stop it. We don't want, those who are benefiting from this, whether they are, Palestinians or UN or INGOs, to continue with this joke of, let's do advocacy about Palestine, let's do advocacy lifting the blockade. They have the very attractive 10, 50, and 100 years of whatever. There is a problem, and there is, abuse of human rights. Everybody can see this. It's been there over 50 years. I was born under occupation. I never lived as a free Palestinian, And, I have been listening to all the resolutions of the UN and read about it and try to educate our kids about it. And at the end of the day, it's all in books, it's all in manuals and toolkits and things like that for NGOs consumption. This is really, really something that is very, very, very frustrating. I think lots of people are taking advantage of this. Israeli is committing, committing a crime against the Palestinian. Everybody knows this, but there are people who are organizations and institutes that are benefiting from this. I remember, for example, in 2014, 2013, lots of INGOs were about to close down And I'm really sorry for being, very negative, and, it's just very, very frustrating. But I was hearing about, lots of INGOs that they were closing down in 2013, 2014, and all of a sudden, 2015, they were on the ground, they were hiring people, and, it was nourishing to them. And this is why I'm saying, let's not talk about Palestine as a humanitarian cause. We are people who have rights, we are people who believe in our rights, and we are not going to give up, whether it's 50 years more or less. We will fight, because this is a right. We are not asking for a gift from the world. We are asking for our rights. I don't know what else to say. I think all of you know what's happening on the ground. You know about people who don't have access to health services. You know how education is deteriorating, even though, we have the highest number of people who are educated in Palestine, but the quality of education has been deteriorating. Youth unemployment, the World Bank is telling you that, Gaza has the highest unemployment rate in the world, and nobody's doing anything about it. People are using this for consumption to maybe write proposals, or I don't know, but it's like, I feel that we are about accountability than anything else. Everybody knows what's happening in Palestine. Everybody knows that occupation is wrong, occupation is illegal, and we need to stop it, and we need to stop it now. And it's not a dream, it's a reality, and everybody should be accountable to this.
Okay, thank you, Majda. Nuria?
So I think if you didn't ask this question about Gaza being part of Palestine, that the panelists would have brought it up, because there's a narrative here that is so dangerous and that is so important for us to counter and to combat in our work. Gaza somehow not being part of Palestine is very much the aim of these closure practices and policies, and we need to recognize the policy with that specific aim, having that specific aim, preventing the Palestinian right to self-determination, essentially, because we would be then preventing, a contiguous state of Palestine that included Gaza, and preventing actually a cohesive Palestinian political system, since I think your question did reference Palestinian politics. It's important when I say that, though, to also recognize the role that the Palestinian political divide plays in terms of compounding the issues that Palestinians in Gaza are facing in terms of violations of their human rights. We heard from Majda about Palestinians not being able to access hospitals. That's a violation of their right to health. And if people are not allowed to access hospitals to the point of it being torture, that's a violation of the obligation on states not to torture and not to ill-treat people. It was also mentioned students not being able to access universities in the West Bank. So that's a violation of the right to education. How about families? People in Gaza not being able to see their families in the West Bank. That's a violation of the right to family life. But, and referring to what Robert said earlier, what it means after 10 years of not being able to see your family, it means that you stop seeing that as an option for your family. You stop seeing the West Bank as part of your home because you can't access it and you've given up trying. It's the same thing with students. Students stop seeing the West Bank as a viable option for their education. They tried in the first few years and they failed. And the student ban has been in place since 2000. I think I'll leave it there and hand over.
Thanks. So I'd like to ask another set of questions about this whole idea of what can we do, right? So, one can think of this in a number of different ways. There's political options, there's legal options. I'm sure that, you work in different fields, and so you pursue this from different areas, but I'm wondering if the panelists can just tell us a little bit about what either they're pursuing in the political realm. For instance, Tania, you mentioned the cracks that might exist in the Israeli system and what kind of opportunities that might provide in order to get in there. At the same time, we've heard a lot about accountability, what kind of justice mechanisms there are, or what kind of political options there are at international organizations, including where we're sitting right now. So I'm not sure who wants to take that one first, but...
we have a comment from Majida.
Sure, please go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to give an example not an example, I just want to remind everybody that, in Gaza Strip, you have a new generation of young people who never visited another city but their own city, Gaza. And, they are the majority. They are more than 90% of the people, 90% of the children. And these children, they lived three hard attacks. Some people call it a war. I don't know what to call it. But it's like, shall we just stop here, or shall we just stop here and say, no, this situation should end, or what? I don't know how to look at the future. For example, my nephews, who are below the age of 13, they saw my friend coming from Jerusalem, and they were asking her if she speaks the same language in her country. They thought Jerusalem is another country. They asked if they fast Ramadan or not. They were asking, simple questions. But it says how much, this whole blockade and closure is, affecting the whole situation. And I want to come back to the whole issue of accountability. I want to say again that, describing the situation is one thing, and everybody knows what's happening in Gaza and in Palestine, in Jerusalem, in West Bank. It's all in the reports, it's in the media, it's by visiting, you know this, or by not being able even to visit or to even access, from the airport. But what are we doing about it? What are you doing about it? Palestine is not a Palestinian cause only. It's a human rights cause, and it's the responsibility of every single human being who knows about Palestine.
So clearly information is not enough, right? You're telling us that there's lots of information out there. It's very clear about what the situation in Gaza is, but no matter how many times and no matter how strongly that information is pushed in front of a public, there doesn't seem to be the kind of reaction that can provoke a change. So, okay, panelists, how do you provoke a change?
All right, I'll try to share some magic bullets or silver bullets, whatever they're called. No, I think that's true. I think that the question of accountability is a really important one, because I think when you ask also most Israelis what's the situation like in Gaza, most people are aware that the situation is difficult. I think that the problem is that they don't see themselves or their government as accountable for that situation. I do think, though, that we have tried to latch on to something that sort of can be seen as positive, and I want to share with those who might not be aware that the language of human rights and international law doesn't have a whole lot of currency in Israel. So as an Israeli organization, we do have to think creatively about different sorts of strategies. But there is one glaring strategy, and that's to talk about interests. And certainly we don't see human rights and security as zero-sum. In fact, the opposite. And what's been interesting is that more and more Israeli security officials and senior politicians have agreed with that assessment, particularly after the latest military operation. So we have on our website, it's a little hard to find, but it's there, a whole list of quotes, a running list of quotes by these senior security and politicians, talking about the connection between well-being, prosperity, reconstruction in Gaza, and Israel's security. We also did a poll, and we found that 2/3 of the Israeli public knows that their security has been harmed by the policy on Gaza. I think that the problem, again, is a question of accountability and a problem of not being shown ways forward. There are no options being presented to the Israeli public, certainly. It's either managing the situation as such or military operations. People are not seeing a way out. So one thing that we do try to do, and I think it's important, is to talk about potential. I do think that there is a lot of potential in Palestine. Anyone who has been there knows it. We've already heard from our friends who are in Gaza talk about how young the population is. About 70% of the population is under the age of 30. People are online, they're doing creative work, they're engaged, they're interested. So I think that showing that potential is a really important motivator for people who, if they're only looking at the humanitarian situation, can feel sort of overwhelmed. We do still go to the courts in Israel. We bring individual legal cases, and we believe that the courts are, they're not necessarily a place to get remedy always, but they're an important platform. They inform the legal system, the public, the media, et cetera, about the kinds of cases that Gisha needs to bring, which really should not be needed, in court.
Can I ask, how do you
Yeah.
respond to the counter case that the Israeli courts really have not been effective in producing any meaningful change, and therefore using the courts is allowing Israel to present itself as if it has a sufficient mechanism for dealing with this, where in fact that might not be the case?
I agree with that in a principled use of the courts. I think on an individual level, we're still able to get remedy for individuals, and I'm not going to make the decision on behalf of individuals whether they would like us to use that tool. If we're still able to get permits for people using that tool, we're going to do it, because of course, if you're looking from a macro perspective up above, you don't see a lot of positive change, but of course the change that happens in one person's life is priceless, and I think that's something that does need to continue. We also use the courts for the Freedom of Information Act, and that is one of the rare places where we actually win cases. So we've uncovered hundreds of documents, and again, those are available on our website. I invite you to look at them. You can see the policy in Israel's own words. It's not our analysis, it's not our interpretation, and I think that that's also a really useful tool to see how things are not connected to security. Security is brought up over and over again, but when you look at these policy documents and you see that there's a quota for how many tomatoes can come out of Gaza every month, and why tomatoes and not strawberries, and why this quota and not that quota, I think it's a really powerful tool to say this policy isn't about security. It's a policy of managing a situation.
So El Mizan's been engaging with the Israeli justice mechanisms for many years. For example, in the latest military bombardment on Gaza, we took over 100 very straightforward, very clear-cut cases, and we submitted them to the Military Advocate General, which is the relevant criminal court authority in Gaza. And out of 107 of the cases which we took individually, there was not even one criminal investigation that was launched. And that was, the bombardment took place now 3 years ago. There was an additional 107 cases that we took, and in those, there were some criminal investigations that were launched, but they weren't to international standards, and there were no indictments filed. So there was complete impunity, to be clear, on all of the cases that El Mizan documented. And of the cases that we submitted were very straightforward, very clear-cut violations of international law, and even those didn't get criminal investigations. So you ask why we still engage with the justice mechanisms in Israel, and it's so that we can understand the system. and so that we know where it's flawed and why it's flawed and where we need to combat it and what language and what evidence we need to give to states in order for them to conduct bilateral engagement with Israel on these issues. An example of understanding the justice system would be a petition that we pursued actually with Gisha in 2012, representing students who wanted to study in the West Bank. And it was within that case that the state responded to the reasons for implementing this ban, and they didn't refer to any individual security claims referring to any of the individuals in the case. Actually, they responded that this was a strategic Israeli policy of a comprehensive ban on all of Gaza, which of course amounts to a collective punishment under international law. And the state said that very clearly as a response to our petition within that case. But we would be satisfied if Israel was able to hold, if Israel was willing, to hold perpetrators of serious violations of international law to account, and was willing to deliver justice to Palestinian victims. Since that's not the case, El Mizan cooperates with the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, and we also coordinate and work with the UN. We have cases in third states in Europe, and so we do exhaust all of the legal avenues available to us in trying to achieve accountability and justice for Palestinians. And our work it's to challenge directly ourselves, but it's also, referring back to my initial statement, it's also to equip states to conduct these challenges themselves within the legal framework, not within the humanitarian framework, because it's the legal framework that allows states to address the root causes of all of this suffering in the Gaza Strip, right? So it's providing states with evidence that the legal system in Israel doesn't work and where it doesn't work.
So with that, maybe we can turn to Nora, who, of course, is a specialist in international law, among other things. I was struck by the reference to the ICC. I will take advantage of this role to make a provocation. Have we gone beyond the era of effective international criminal justice? It seems like the court is kind of falling apart. It seems like it's not, when it's used solely in a politicized manner. Why should anybody have any faith in international justice mechanisms to secure some kind of remedy in this case?
Robert? If you wanted to ask someone that question rhetorically, it should have probably been given to somebody else, because I think that in my study of the ICC and its history and its current unraveling, I think that your statement stands. There's a few things to consider about it, that since the requisite number of states have ratified the Rome Statute in 2002, bringing the court into existence, that because of the mechanisms available within the Rome Statute, so one is just very clearly Article 17 on complementarity, which says that any state that can investigate its own self shall be shielded from the jurisdiction or spared the jurisdiction of the ICC. That in and of itself, as a minimum threshold, already exempts most industrialized states from the specter of ICC jurisdiction. Then there's the other additional piece of it, which the US has pursued both under President Clinton as well as President Bush II, which is to enter into bilateral agreements with other states that if their military forces, if US military forces should participate in activity triggering international criminal law, that shall be settled bilaterally between the two states, again to avoid the specter of the ICC. So already we see set up structurally a world court that actually doesn't apply to the world. In fact, the largest state, which is also a member of the ICC, is Brazil. And so to think about who are we concerned with then when we're thinking about ICC jurisdiction, it precedes the 2014 accession of Palestine onto the Rome Statute, triggering its jurisdiction to examine questions concerning the 2014 bombardment of the Gaza Strip. In the criminal court's existence, up until 2014, the only cases that it brought were against African leaders, with the exception of Milosevic. And now, as a result of that, and because of the last warrant issued for al-Bashir of Sudan, several African states have already indicated that they're on the brink of withdrawing completely from the Rome Statute. And so we already, the mechanism and the structure is unstable. Now add to it that I don't necessarily disagree with the Palestine bid to the ICC, but consider the fact that the first industrialized state that would be prosecuted by the ICC would be Israel, which is the US's most self-proclaimed most significant ally in the Middle East. I mean, what we are presenting to the Office of the Prosecutor, and specifically Ms. Bensouda, is that to take the risk of bringing this case full force risks unraveling the ICC because of the precarious nature that stilts that it stands on. So then we have to ask, well, is it worth it anyway? And again, here we have to examine a few things. One is Article 17 of complementarity. As Nuria vividly demonstrated, there have been no accountability, Israeli accountability taken, and yet it's pursuing and continuing to pursue several criminal investigations that can drag on forever. Consider also that the Office of the Prosecutor, in its preliminary investigation to investigate war crimes in Afghanistan, where war has been ongoing, was in a preliminary investigation for 10 years. That's just to decide if there is enough evidence to bring a case. So when we think about how this is going to apply to the question of the Gaza Strip as an accountability measure, for us to wait on this is really to put our eggs in the wrong basket and to put a lot of Palestinian hopes in the wrong basket when we have other mechanisms available to us that don't have to go through this political, these political firewalls, which are probably going to be counterproductive. I want to mention just two of them, and those have to do with the fact that, yes, the fact-finding mission to the Gaza Strip in 2009 was shelved and seems to be irrelevant, but within it are still recommendations that any state can pursue, including applying sanctions for arms to Israel. There is no reason not to apply those sanctions which have been recommended. There has been a recommendation to reconvene, to affirm the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Convention to the Gaza Strip after unilateral withdrawal. There's no reason not to affirm that and then to categorize everything flowing therefrom as a violation of those terms, including a willful breach rising to the status of war crime. There is also the ICJ's 2004 advisory opinion, which indicates what we can do not simply in the Gaza Strip, but also in the West Bank, because I mention this because one of the things that the portfolio to the ICC has is the question of settlements in the West Bank. And I'm saying if we wait on that, that's not necessarily going to yield the results that we want. We already have an ICJ decision that's recommended sanctions and no participation with Israel in any economic shape, way, or form that would continue the construction of the wall running, 85% of it running through the West Bank. So the ICC is rife with these political triggers, firewalls, frankly, placing false hope in it. It can last for an extensively long time, and yet we already have these mechanisms available to us. I think what's missing from it is political will. And if we don't have political will to do something, at the very least we should have political will not to do something, which is at least, again, building on what was said earlier, not to participate in those mechanisms that have normalized the blockade. The Gaza reconstruction mechanism makes the blockade normal by making the UN, the PA, and all of us complicit in the mechanism rather than boycotting it. The PA not paying for electricity in the Gaza Strip right now normalizes blockade. And that is not just a political decision, but also has to do with decisions by other states who are funding the PA and conditioning its funding on where they can spend those funds. So everyone in this room can play a role in participating in those accountability mechanisms.
Great. And with that, let's open it up for questions. I want to call everybody's attention to the panel that you have in front of you. I will recognize you before you speak, and please do not press the button to turn your microphone on until I recognize you. I think Dr. Baghrouti had indicated he wanted to speak.
First of all, occupation is still there in Gaza. Can you hear me? Yeah. And by the way, something that was not mentioned, there are 2 million people living in 140 square miles, but 25% of that land is already prohibited for Palestinians because it's a buffer zone that is controlled by Israel. So 1/4 of that area is controlled by the Israeli army. Second, it's 11 years of blockade, but it's not just Israel. In my opinion, big parts of the international community are complicit in this blockade because they are allowing it to continue. Third, it's a misleading statement to claim that the blockade is there because of Hamas. By the way, these restrictions started way before Hamas took the responsibility of governing Gaza. It started in 1991, to be precise. And more than that, the blockade and the embargo and the siege on us was put not on Hamas government only, but also on the national unity government, which included Hamas, Fatah, Mubadara, DFLP, and others. When 96% of the people who were elected in the Palestinian parliament were in the government, that government was under blockade. And that led to the split, which now creates this situation. The clear evidence is that Israel wants to separate Gaza from West Bank so that it can absorb the West Bank, so it can annex the West Bank, so that it can prohibit and prevent the establishment of an independent state. Another very clear factor, Israel already conducted 4 wars on Gaza. 2006, 2008, 2012, 2014, the results of which you are very well aware of. And when you speak about violence, it becomes unclear. What does violence mean? If you are under aggression, do you have the right to defend yourself or not? The question is, when 97% of the water in Gaza is polluted or salinated, when people don't have electricity more than 3 hours a day, when hospitals are about to shut down, when not only the sea and the land is polluted, but air also because of the necessity of using generators, when 450,000 people have lost their homes because of the bombardment in 2014, and most of them did not have their homes back yet, when 80% of people who are educated are unemployed, and when 1,700 sick people today cannot get to hospitals, many of them are having cancers, do people have the right to resist that or not? If they don't resist this intolerable injustice, they would be simply behaving as slaves. And I don't think anybody here would want the Palestinians to behave as slaves. This is the exact reality of the situation today. The reality is that Israel and most Israeli people, unfortunately, don't consider Palestinians as equal human beings. And that's why all these policies are justified. And this will not be corrected by going and dealing with one individual case here and there. The real question here is why the people who are under occupation for 50 years are being punished, why in West Bank, in Gaza, in Jerusalem, and everywhere, while the occupier itself is not punished. And when we ask for punishment of the occupier, we are accused of being anti-Semitic. The reality today, and that's what should be clear here in the United Nations, is that one country has violated every international law, which is Israel. One country, which is Israel, is allowed to be impunitive to international law, and this country will not stop behaving in this manner unless it is sanctioned and boycott, and unless it is forced to pay for the occupation it has been conducting for 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a few questions and comments, and then we'll come back to our panelists to see if they want to comment. Oh, come on.
It's telling. There's no question.
Yeah. I mean, is that the degree of fatalism that people have reached about Gaza, that they don't have questions, comments, suggestions? Please.
With regard to the issue in Gaza, I wanted to get your panelists' opinion on the issue of natural gas reserves off the coast of Gaza and the role that they think it might be playing in the continuation of this closure, because as has been mentioned, the international community is very much aware of what is happening in the Gaza Strip, but there is also a keen interest in ensuring the free flow of natural gas as a potential alternative to the reliance on Russian gas. And what role do they think that interest in natural gas reserves plays in the continuation of the closure on the Gaza Strip?
Yep, please.
International access to the Gaza Strip, and maybe also draw comparisons to other situations around the world where such limitations on international access occurred. I think that might be of interest.
And please.
I'm a Palestinian human rights activist in Toronto. I just have a question for Gisha and Al-Mizan. How far is it possible to launch a mass case against Israel blockade to Gaza? I agree with Mustafa that, like, to deal with a case here or a case there, it's good in a way, but it's not anymore like of a profit to address the whole issue of blockade. So how far can we, like as civil society, as organizations with human rights, as Palestinians activists, as Al-Mizan and Gisha organization who deals with legal issue, how far can we launch a mass case against the blockade of Gaza done by the Israeli authorities?
Okay, let's take a round up here. Please keep your answers brief so we can do subsequent rounds afterwards.
I guess I'll respond to the last question. I mean, I think, you know, our whole existence as an organization is one mass case against the situation. I think that what I tried to describe is that using the legal channel is not so effective. So while it might make us feel good about ourselves to bring more principled cases, we would be basically thrown out of the court very quickly. So, you know, again, and I recognize the feeling of frustration, and I can imagine that it seems, again, like one case here and there. Over the course of time, these are thousands of cases and thousands of individuals whose lives are changed by these efforts. And I think it would be easy for me. I live in Tel Aviv. It's a pretty decent place to live. That I would say, no, I'm only going to bring principled cases. No, I really do think that people who are living under conditions of closure have a right to try to free themselves, even if it's on an individual level, and I respect their desire to do so. And I do think that you're right that we need to work in parallel on the larger questions and on trying to create policy change on a bigger level, and I think that's why we're here.
I'll respond to the same question just briefly to say that the cases that Al Mizan is pursuing in Europe, those are on the issue of arms trade as impacts Palestinian civilians in Gaza and third states during the major bombardments conducted on the Gaza Strip. But I would also point you towards a joint submission that Al Mizan made with our partners. Al-Haq is another one of the partners who's here today, that we made to the Office of the Prosecutor at the International Criminal Court on the issue of closure. The analysis was done through the crime of persecution. And it looked at all of the different elements that we've been speaking about today as they relate to the Rome Statute. Of course, while European states support other countries going to the ICC, they somehow can't find it within themselves to support Palestine cooperating with the ICC. And at the same time, there are so many helpful recommendations that we've heard over the past decade and more, which Noura was pointing to, the ICJ opinion being one, all of these tools that we have that the international community could use that is not using. So on the one hand, you have states telling us we shouldn't approach the ICC on Palestine, and on the other hand, those same states are not using the legal mechanisms that they have in their power to use. The High Commissioner, the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights recently issued a report. It was a comprehensive report on all of these recommendations made by the UN on accountability. And there was so many really critical and helpful recommendations that have been made, like the 2009 fact-finding mission. And they're just repeated year after year after year, and then they're compiled in this report by the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And then he is largely himself just kind of repeating those within his recommendations as well, because there was no practical step that was given to us that we were told we can use. So we're told we can't use the ICC, and states aren't using the mechanisms available to them. And then there are also opportunities where the High Commissioner for Human Rights could use his position to recommend a practical step, effective tools to the Human Rights Council, and then instead there was something kind of arbitrary and vague that was recommended. I want to also respond to the question before that about the natural gas reserves, but then just to turn the question around and to ask states, right? Because I think that it is our role as civil society to remind states that we're paying attention. And so the role that the sale of natural resources plays in prolonging the entire conflict, not just the closure of Gaza regarding the natural gas reserves. This is something that we need to continue to follow and to try to understand, as it's a political conflict, and so solving the conflict relates to political willingness, and what does it take for a state to be willing, and what is the cost, and who is benefiting.
Majda, Mohammed, do you want to weigh in?
Yes, I just want to say again that accountability is the way to change, because there are lots of treaties, there are lots of laws, and we don't need to think again and again and again in the details of how we can do this and how we can do that. Occupation is illegal, blockade is illegal. Israel is committing crimes, and this is a non-stop act. I hate to hear about mechanisms and process and, ICC and, whatever, because all of this are making the occupation longer. I think there is one fact, that there is a situation that is sick and it's wrong, it's illegal, and it's a human rights cause that everybody is responsible to change this situation. And this will not change unless we bring Israel accountable to all its acts against the Palestinian people in West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza. Another thing is that, now the Israeli occupation is trying to undermine all our efforts, even with the non-violent resistance and resilience. And, they are trying to make lots of small issues to make us occupied with the details, like, raising one issue here, one issue there, where our all advocacy efforts are scattered, and we cannot reach to any solution. By the end of the day, we have a small win here and small loss here. Again, I think if we haven't addressed its occupation, it's illegal. Israel should be accountable to its acts, and it should end. It's not difficult. It's clear, and there are responsibilities, but people are not doing what they should do.
Yeah, here I'm Mohammed Azaiza again. I wanted to say also that we have to mention and to focus about the potential for people in Gaza. I mean here the potential for education and also the economic itself. It seems there's like a high chance for the people in Gaza. I mean here that the people in Gaza and the youth, especially the youth, deserve the better life because they love life, and that should also support all of us in order to continue to work hard to help the region to be stable by find more solutions for the Palestinians, especially for the people in Gaza. So here the people deserve the best life, and they are willing to continue without any more problems like others everywhere. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you. Majda's comment about it's very clear that the issue is occupation. There needs to be accountability for it. It is crystal clear, but I think the problem is that, okay, well, these legal decisions are not self-implementing, and the decisions of this organization are not self-implementing. Reminds me, an Arab official here at the UN once said to me that she had been in a meeting with, and there was an Israeli official there, and the Israeli official said to her, "Oh, it must give you great pleasure that this body is so pro-Palestinian in its resolutions." And she looked at him and said, "Yes, it does give me pleasure that it is pro-Palestinian in its decisions, but it must give you, as an Israeli, great pleasure that this body is so unable to implement any of its pro-Palestinian decisions." So I think this is where we get stuck. That some things are obvious, but there's no obvious way for these things to move forward. Nora, do you want to comment before we open it up again?
The thing I wanted to mention was about not the natural gas, but about this idea of law and politics and what the relationship is in this situation. So usually we have a series of human rights laws and international norms from which a political solution can flow. What happens very clearly in this situation is a bifurcation, a separation between human rights law and international norms and possible political solutions. And that framework then is what holds us hostage altogether. So think about it like this. Since 1967, the U.S. inaugurated a dual policy towards Israel where on the one hand there would be a negotiated solution. So a land for peace framework. So any kind of international law would therefore mitigate Israel's negotiating position. That's the basic structure, plus this idea that Israel would have the qualitative military edge over all other Arab states, singularly or collectively, which means that any sanctions could diminish Israel's military edge, and we should avoid that. So these two policies that have been inaugurated by the US since 1967, 5 decades now, basically say that international law, human rights, will impede a political solution, and that any sanctions and accountability will impede Israel's presence. This, at the very basis, is part of the impasse that we're facing right now. And rather than resist it, instead, the UN, as well as Palestinians and Arab states, have been a part of this equation because we've also adopted the idea that human rights are great, but they would impede a political solution. Hence, the reason that we haven't seen the PA/PLO run with the ICJ's recommendation for sanctions. Hence, why we haven't seen why the PA/PLO run with the recommendations of the fact-finding report or the Goldstone, also known as the Goldstone report. Hence, why we can have recommendations on settlements and their illegality and not see international other states run with recommendations for sanctions, because everything is framed, all forms of accountability based on these universal legal principles are framed as impediments to a political solution and to a peace process. That is a fallacy. That is a fallacy. That is a discursive framework meant to paralyze us and to incapacitate our efficacy. In all other situations that have led to resolution, South Africa, Northern Ireland, even the Balkans where it's tenuous, or the former Republic of the Yugoslavia and its breakup, they start from human rights and then build politics. In this situation, and this was said to me by an Israeli negotiator in one of our interviews, where he said, clearly, in this situation, we come up with a political solution and then fit it into the law. The decision is ours of whether or not we're going to accept that framework and what we find as palatable. If we had a political solution that we can fit into law, maybe we should accept that. But as has been pointed out, there's been political intransigence. And if not that, then at least let the legal mechanisms run their course, which requires dropping the fallacy and the paralyzing framework of all law and accountability being an impediment to the peace process.
Okay, let's open it up again. I can see Nicaragua.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much.
Los panelistas y exponentes.
I'd like to thank all the panelists and those who've spoken. I've listened carefully to the comments and presentations, and I fully share. Is there interpretation? Can you hear the interpretation into English and other languages? Yes? All right. I agree with the points made. My comment and some thoughts, because truth to tell, as a member of the international community and member state, despite of our solidarity with the Palestinian cause, we are ashamed, if I may say so, to be unable to act and to make greater efforts to hold this crime against humanity as labeled by many international organizations, which is the case with this criminal blockade, particularly at this point in time when we are dealing with the Agenda 2030. What about this issue? We've always, as Nicaragua mentioned, these issues in our statement. It's a vicious cycle to build and rebuild, to kill. It's a vicious circle. And what it allows Gaza to do is only to survive. They can't even get sustainable development. It's just a survival in the midst of massive destruction, massacre, then economic help to restart, and then we start this vicious circle again. The Euro-Mediterranean Monitor for Human Rights tells us that 6,000 hours of isolation for Gaza, the catastrophic outcome of Israel's war in Gaza are something incredible. We all know this, all of this, but how are we selling this to our international community of which we are members? How can we support the achievement of the goal? This is a key issue on our agenda. This is where the very basic rights of all human beings begin. In Gaza, with the blockade and isolation, and we remain silent on something which is so key for the international community. We say no one should be left behind. Where are we at regarding that? Thank you.
Thank you. I can see a green light up in the back.
Yes, David Wildman with Global Ministries of the United Methodist Church. And it seems from what I've heard from all the panelists, the struggle is on enforcement of international law. And so I'd like to just ask, in 1982 and again in 1983, in the aftermath of Israel's invasion of Lebanon, the UN General Assembly here called for an international boycott of Israel, and it called for international sanctions to be imposed on the Israeli state. So that was the UN here calling for that 45 years ago. So I just want to say it's out there. So in that context, what I found is when governments are unwilling or unable to take up the responsibilities of upholding international law, it's up to civil society to take actions. And so I'd like comments on, in the face of collective punishment imposed on Gaza and the horrendous suffering we've heard both from the folks, our colleagues in Gaza and from the panel, the role of boycotting Israel as a form of civil society sanctions imposed in the urgency, given the lack of will by member states to take action. Thank you.
Please.
Thank you. My name is Osama Aliwat. I'm from Combatants for Peace Organization. I have some questions here, and I agree with everything you said, but I want to make some things clear for myself at least. So I wanted to ask some questions. First of all, it's strange that this thing happening in Gaza in 2017. And I wanted to ask Nuria here, like, what are you trying to reach? Is to allow Gazan people to have more products and medicine to enter into Gaza, or just to move the siege? Because if we allow them to have more products inside Gaza, they don't have money to buy it, so it makes no sense. People don't have work there. The second thing that we started, and we mentioned here that the siege on Gaza started since 1993 and not 2007. But the situation of Gazan people, when Palestinian Authority was taking care of the situation there, was way better than today. So who's responsible? Yeah, I wanted to know that, like, why the Palestinian Authority succeeded to deal with this situation even though it was under siege, and now Hamas don't succeed to deal with this. And if they don't succeed to deal with this, why they don't move away and give it to the Palestinian Authority back? And I heard Noura here talking about that the electricity problem and the Palestinian Authority don't pay the bills. If Hamas collect the taxes of Gaza people, why they don't pay the bills? Why the Palestinian Authority in West Bank have to pay for Gaza everything? And they are from my people, they are Palestinians, I agree with that. But as long as there is someone responsible there, he has to take his responsibilities. Thank you. One more point. Sorry. We blame all the time, and I agree with that, that Israel is taking big responsibility of what's happening in Gaza. Yeah? What about Egypt?
Excellent
Thank you.
point. Please.
All right. My name is Jesse Root. I just have a conversation how this kind of ties into the conversation around the hopefully eventual resolution of the occupation, and whether we talk about that in terms of a one-state or two-state solution. Hearing folks on the panel talk about a contiguous Palestinian state that includes Gaza and the West Bank seems to maybe be taking for granted the two-state solution is the best solution for the occupation. I wonder if the panelists have any input on that, and maybe what the end to the occupation looks like as a one-state solution, considering the issues in Gaza and the West Bank.
Okay, I see that we're getting close, so we're going to take one more short comment, very short comment, and then we'll have an opportunity for very short responses to some very difficult questions from the panelists.
Hello, hello. Yeah. My name is Abdul Hamid Sayam. I am an accredited journalist here at the United Nations and a former UN staff. And I have been asking every president of the Security Council, when they do their first press conference at the beginning of the month, why you don't take a delegation and go visit Gaza. And I never got a straightforward answer. I mean, the ambassador from Uruguay and from Bolivia, they were honest in their answer when they said there is no consensus in the Security Council. As you know, now there is a tradition where wherever there is a trouble area, there is a delegation from the Security Council go visit. And they just came back from Haiti. So my question, would it be possible to replace those delegations and do a civil society delegation, and it becomes a tradition to go every time and then to go visit Gaza and come back and report here in the United Nations about the situation in Gaza. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So we have not quite enough minutes for all of our panelists to have 2 minutes each, which, what? Everyone will get their 2 minutes, but I'm going to keep you to 2 minutes, okay? So I'm going to start tapping when we get to 2 minutes, okay? So let's start with our panelists from Gaza. Let me say, you each get, I'm giving each of, everybody gets 2 minutes. It's not just that Gaza gets 2 minutes. Everybody gets 2 minutes. So go ahead. Majda, Mohammed, 2 minutes each.
You know, again, I want to stress that accountability is the address to our issue, and the occupation should end. Every single person and every single country and every single institution should be working towards that. If we can say no to Israel and stop the crimes that the Israelis are committing towards the Palestinian people in Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza, then the situation is going to be better. And I assure you, as a Palestinian, if we are free and when we are going to be free, we know how to live, and don't worry about this. So it's not about not being able to go forward. No, it's about changing the situation now so we can go forward with our society, with our young people, with all the energy that we have and all the natural and human resources that we have, because we can live and we know how to live, and we are civilized people, not as what the Israeli media has trying to show us, and again, the address is accountability to Israel. And I think the countries, even if they don't have census in the UN, they should act, they should raise their voice, and they should do things, maybe each country alone, but we need to start. But the situation can't continue like this because, it's really, really, really difficult here.
No comments from Mohammed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. Tania.
So thanks, Osama, for your questions. I'll choose to answer those questions in my 2 minutes. Like I hinted in my comments, Palestinian leaders are also engaging in this experiment regarding Gaza. My feeling is that, residents of Gaza are being used as bargaining chips in the political struggles between Israel and the PA, and the PA and Hamas and Israel. All of them need to be accountable for the situation. And Israel and the PA have successfully turned this issue of electricity into one as if it's just about payment. It's not about payment. It's not about finding the funding. It's about imposing pressure on Hamas or on residents of Gaza for the purpose of achieving political goals, which sounds very familiar to me as somebody who has been following the situation in Gaza for at least the past 10 years. So I think that it's important that we recognize that there are other actors. And again, I don't absolve Israel for its role in this. 50 years of occupation, 10 years of closure. The situation of the energy crisis in Gaza is a chronic one. It didn't start just now with the PA refusing to pass the payment on to Israel. It's a chronic problem, and Israel has much to do with it. But that said, there are other actors involved, and they need to be accountable. And I would say the same is true regarding Egypt. It hasn't come up, and it's a good question. Rafah crossing is a vital connection for residents of Gaza to the outside world. It's been mostly closed since mid-2013. It opens occasionally, and there are tens of thousands of people on waiting lists at all times to try to exit via Rafah. Again, Israel as the occupier, 50 years, 10 years of closure, it bears the primary responsibility for the situation in Gaza, but that doesn't absolve other actors of their responsibilities, and Rafah should be opened for travel of people.